In the beginning of 1996, Pokemon Red and Green became a massive success in Japan, so it seemed obvious to start developing sequels right away. And while that is what initially happened, the studio behind Pokemon, Game Freak, had spent 6 long years bringing Red and Green to life. By the time Gold and Silver entered production, not only was the team completely exhausted, the studio was also running out of money. On top of that, Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokemon, wanted Gold and Silver to be the most complete, ultimate Pokemon experience. Games so ambitious that in hindsight, they would still hold up against entries released decades later. Meanwhile, the team also had to pour time and energy into various other projects, including making other games to stay in business. What was initially estimated as a year's worth of work turned into a 3-year project. To better understand the multiple delays, design decisions, and why lots of content had to be cut, we have to go back to March 1996, right after Pokemon Red and Green released in Japan. The games were flying off the shelves, and it quickly became clear Pokemon had the potential to become not just a hit in Japan, but a global phenomenon. To ensure its success, 2 things had to happen at the same time. The original games needed to be prepared for an international release, and the team had to start creating sequels. However, the developers at Game Freak were mentally and physically exhausted from pushing themselves to the limit for 6 years creating Red and Green. To help relieve some of that exhaustion and pressure, one of the first things the studio did was hire more developers. That said, the core programming team stayed surprisingly small. Gold and Silver had only 4 programmers, the same as Red and Green. In total, about 20 developers worked on the sequels. Unfortunately, Game Freak was now facing another problem. According to Junichi Masuda, the composer of Red and Green, the studio was running short on development funds. After Red and Green came out and the follow-up games, we didn't have a lot of money. We were kind of out of money at that point because we had spent all the development funds and everything, so we needed to make some other games to stay in business. Therefore, Junichi himself was initially not involved with the production of Silver and Gold, as he had to step away to work on Bazaru the Gozaru, New Game the Gozaru, and Warriors Legend of the Blue Dragon, 2 Game Freak games that were never released outside of Japan. Despite being low on funds, Satoshi Tajiri decided that the sequels to Red and Green should be the ultimate Pokemon games. His goal was to add so many big improvements that fans would look back on the games fondly, even after many years. Satoshi felt the titles had to reflect that ambition. Early on, before much of anything was locked in, he thought it might be a nice idea to call the games Pink or Purple. However, he didn't want fans to see the sequels simply as extensions of the originals, so he decided to move away from the color theme entirely and name the games after rare materials instead, as a way of signaling a significantly forward for the franchise. Before we move on, I'd like to talk about this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN. ExpressVPN is a virtual private network. It basically serves to shield unexpressed data and location for months of VPN gameplay ideas. One priority they kept coming back to was accessibility. They expected Gold and Silver to be a lot of players' first Pokemon game, so they looked for ways to make Pokemon easier to understand for people of all ages. One of their early solutions was an in-game magazine called Pokemon Journal. The idea was that players could find copies while checking random bookshelves, then read short articles with details about Pokemon, useful items, and little updates about what was happening in different towns and cities. While this feature didn't make it in the final games, a version of Pokemon Journal did exist in a demo from 1997, but more on that later. A lot of the features Gold and Silver introduced might feel normal now. Things like a day and night cycle, Pokemon holding items, breeding, male and female versions of all Pokemon, roaming legendaries, and even shiny Pokemon, but at the time they were considered revolutionary additions. Several ideas for a new Pokédex were also discussed. In the first games you couldn't search Pokemon by name or sort them by type, and Satoshi wanted the upgraded Pokédex to feel more like a real tool instead of a static list. Furthermore, the team considered the fact that some players might not have any friends that also play Pokemon, so they started experimenting with ways to make the world feel more social. That's where the Pokégear and its phone feature comes in. It allowed players to collect phone numbers from NPCs who would then periodically call you for updates and rematches. In July 1996, about 4 months after development began, the sequels were officially announced in an issue of CoroCoro comic. They were revealed simply as Pokémon 2, alongside the debut of the first new Pokémon, Ho-Oh, and a targeted release window of spring 1997. But despite the big reveal, the reality is that not much had been built yet, because Game Freak was extremely busy dealing with other important things. The sudden, massive popularity of Pokémon meant that preparing the previous generation of games for a worldwide release took priority. Additionally, the franchise began expanding into other lanes that each came with their own production schedules, partners, and deadlines. For instance, the Pokémon trading card game launched in Japan in October 1996, and the anime began airing in April 1997. Around the same time, Satoshi was starting to feel the weight of his role, not only as Pokémon's creator, but also as the president of Game Freak. He had many responsibilities, and with everything happening at once, the sequel's early development moved slower than anticipated. That's when Junichi Masuda was brought back in and began taking on a big portion of Satoshi's workload and day-to-day leadership on the project. Development wasn't going as well as we had hoped it would. At that point, I kind of took over and we decided to make the game based on Kyoto, and we sort of rapidly developed the game from that point on. Ever since then, Satoshi mostly stepped out of the public spotlight and let other people handle the day-to-day development, while he focuses on research and the bigger picture concepts. Once development started moving faster, Ken Sugimori and the other artists had to shift into overdrive, because Gold and Silver needed a whole new wave of Pokemon designs. Ken shared in an interview that generally Pokemon are inspired by a shape, figure, or creature that already exists. Other times, the design process goes the other way around, with the artist thinking about what would be interesting from a gameplay perspective first. For Gold and Silver specifically, it was important to introduce new Pokemon types to better balance the games, as it was clear that Psychic Pokemon dominated the original games. While the team was creating plenty of brand new Pokemon, they also pulled in some unused designs from the first games and gave them a second chance in Gold and Silver. On top of that, they started looking back at the original roster and asking new questions. What would be interesting to see evolve into something bigger, and which Pokemon felt like they were missing a pre-evolution? Other designs came from a sudden burst of inspiration, like Unknown. Ken has said it's usually pretty easy to look at a Pokemon and guess what it was inspired by, so he wanted to create a design where the origin wasn't immediately obvious. Something that felt like it could have come from outer space or another dimension, and that's how Unknown was born. This time around, Game Freak also considered how new designs would affect merchandising and the animated series that was in the works. Therefore, in some cases, designs were altered to make it easier to animate those Pokemon in a TV show. A lot of ideas also came from the developers' own childhood memories, sometimes comforting ones, sometimes unsettling ones that stuck with them for years. Ken shared one example. When he was a kid, he had a pet bird, and one day he was shocked to see it standing on only one leg. He later learned that was perfectly normal for that kind of bird, but the image stayed with him. That small moment inspired him to create Hoot Hoot. Just like during the development of the previous games, the team wasn't concerned about how much memory was available on the Game Boy, knowing they would have to cut many designs later on. By 1997, the games already counted over 350 Pokemon, meaning at least 100 had to be removed by the end of development. Many of these scrap Pokemon were included in the 1997 demo shown at Nintendo Space World, a live trade show where Nintendo showcased upcoming games and hardware. Lots of scrap pre-evolutions and evolutions of Gen 1 Pokemon could be seen in the demo, such as baby forms for Paris, Growlite, Doduo, and Goldeen, plus evolved forms for Pinsir, Tangela, Farfetch'd, and Ditto. The demo also revealed that 2 different starters were considered during development. Instead of Cyndaquil, it featured a bear-like Pokemon called Flambear, and instead of Totodile, a sea-like Pokemon called Cruise was the water starter. And as mentioned earlier, the in-game magazine Pokemon Journal was accessible in the Space World demo using the player's PC. The demo also included a few early hints about the story. In Professor Oak's opening narration, he says that a year earlier, 2 boys helped him complete the Pokédex. After that, new Pokemon species began appearing across the country, which prompted Oak to leave Kanto and move to Silent Hill, an obvious placeholder name for what will become New Bark Town. He sets up a new lab there, and now he needs help researching and discovering these newly emerging Pokemon. What's especially interesting is this text was only discovered after the demo leaked online in 2018, and people were able to play the demo's story mode, which was inaccessible at the Space World event itself. Needless to say, Oak's monologue is very different in the final release. During the Space World event in 1997, Satoshi Tajiri actually commented on the story when he was asked whether characters from the original games would return. He said there would be a different protagonist, but that familiar faces like Ash and Professor Oak would show up again. He also hinted that Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, would make his return too. Early builds back up that statement, as Giovanni can be found in a 1997 demo at the radio tower, and he even appears as an Elite Four member in the Space World demo from 1999. However, in the final versions of Gold and Silver, Giovanni never appears at all. Another significant difference in the 1997 demo is the layout of the Johto region map. In the final games, Johto bears a close resemblance to Japan's Kansai region, but in that earlier build, the map looks closer to a rough, compressed version of all of Japan. Because of that, it's very possible the original plan was something broader, before Junichi stepped in and pushed for a stronger identity, one that leaned into the feel of older Japanese cities like Kyoto, Nara, and Osaka. During development, Junichi even did on-site research in Kyoto, riding around in taxis and talking with drivers to learn more about local landmarks. Places like the Toji and Kinkakuji temples would go on to inspire locations such as the bell tower in the games. The four programmers struggled to implement every single new feature, as well as include 251 Pokemon, 100 more than in the original games. As a result, load times were sluggish, battles could take a while to start, and there was even a noticeable pause when Pokemon popped out of their Pokeballs in battle. Halfway through development, Game Freak upgraded from a 2 megabit Game Boy cartridge to a 4 megabit cartridge. That gave them the extra space needed to include the Kanto region, effectively doubling the amount of content. But it didn't fix performance because the code simply wasn't written in an efficient and optimized way. This is where the late Satoru Iwata comes in. At the time, he wasn't working at Nintendo yet. He was the president of HAL Laboratory, the studio best known for Kirby and the Mother series. Iwata was also a board member at Creatures Inc., the company that handled a lot of the licensing requests before the Pokemon Company was established in 1998 and took over brand management. That connection is what pulled Iwata into Pokemon in the first place, because he became involved with analyzing the best way to localize the overseas versions of Pokemon Red and Green. He would study the source code himself, then relay localization advice back to the relevant team at Nintendo. Once Iwata got familiar with the code, he took it upon himself to port the battle system over to the Nintendo 64 for Pokemon Stadium, which completely stunned Shigeki Morimoto, one of the programmers on Red and Green. I created that battle program and it really took a long time to put together, but when I heard that Iwata-san had been able to port it over in about a week and that it was already working, well, I thought, what kind of company president is this? I was saying things like, is that guy a programmer or is he the president? After seeing how capable Iwata was as a programmer, it makes sense why Game Freak reached out to him for help on Gold and Silver. Iwata studied the in-house engine they'd built from scratch and dug through the assembly code that was powering the games. And once he understood how everything fit together, he built compression tools that cut down on load times and improved performance in areas where the games were really struggling. The founder of Creatures Inc., Tsunekazu Ishihara, was a producer on both Red and Green and Silver and Gold. To ensure Gold and Silver's chances of success, Tsunekazu himself not only approved many licensing requests, but also developed products like the trading card game. He treated Gold and Silver like a personal finish line, as he genuinely thought that once these games were done, he'd be finished with Pokemon. So he went all in while the window was still open, trying to set the franchise up as strongly as possible before handing it off. Interestingly, there was one thing he almost didn't approve, and it's probably the last thing you'd expect. Tsunekazu initially pushed back on the anime, because after looking into it, he saw that most animated series only last 6 months, maybe a year. The series was set to begin airing in April 1997, and at that point Gold and Silver were planned for a 1998 release. Tsunekazu felt it would be a bad look if Silver and Gold came out after the anime had already been cancelled. Of course, no one could have predicted at the time that the Pokemon anime would be one of the most popular animated series of all time, and would still be going strong almost 30 years later. Even though Junichi Masuda had already taken on a big share of the directing responsibilities, he still worked on the soundtrack too, and he did it using the same pipeline he used on Red and Green. Junichi composed the tracks on a Commodore Amiga, converted them into MIDI data, and then ran that MIDI data through software he had written himself to convert it into data the Game Boy could actually play. After a string of delays, Gold and Silver were still aiming for a 1998 release window, but ongoing work on other projects like Pokemon Yellow kept pushing the schedule back. In the end, Yellow took the 1998 release slot that Gold and Silver originally held. Then, after 3 long years of development, Pokemon Gold and Silver finally launched in Japan in November 1999. After only a single day, Silver and Gold had sold 1.4 million copies. By April 2000, the two games had moved roughly 6.5 million units in Japan, completely shattering the sales record of the previous entries. When the games were released in the US, they sold a combined 1.4 million copies in their first week, more than double what Pokemon Yellow sold in the same time frame. That made them the fastest selling games of their time. By the end of their run, Gold and Silver had sold over 23 million copies worldwide, making them the third best-selling Game Boy title, behind Tetris and the original Pokemon games. It's probably safe to say that Game Freak succeeded in their mission to create the ultimate Pokemon games with Silver and Gold. More than 25 years later, they're still talked about as some of the best Pokemon games ever made. And for a lot of fans, they're the benchmark new games get compared to. Gold and Silver were followed up by Pokemon Crystal a year later, and it was the first Pokemon title fully directed by Junichi Masuda. According to Ken Sugimori, the main reason Game Freak made Pokemon Crystal was because Nintendo needed a good launch title to help sell the mobile adapter GB, a peripheral that allowed the Game Boy Color to connect to a mobile phone and utilize its cellular network. The game's title is tied to that idea. Crystal was meant to evoke the crystals used in electronic transmissions. Tsunekazu Ishihara didn't end up leaving Pokemon behind after Gold and Silver. He admitted he couldn't walk away once the sequel sold even faster than the originals. Thanks to him and many others, Pokemon grew into the biggest media franchise in the world. The most recent mainline games, Scarlet and Violet, have become the second best-selling Pokemon games ever, passing 27 million copies sold. With 2026 marking Pokemon's 30th anniversary, it shows no signs of slowing down. At the same time, Tsunekazu worries that if Pokemon ever gets too complacent, the franchise will run into trouble. With Pokemon already facing lots of criticism for leaning too hard on the same formula, it's hard not to wonder when that might happen. If we continue focusing on our mission, Pokemon can probably continue to its 50th or 100th anniversary. But if we become complacent and go with the flow, that's when Pokemon will go downhill.
Legendary Pokemon are some of the most important Pokemon in each game, but at this point, there are so many that it can be hard to remember the important details for each one, like their lore, inspiration, and more. Well, worry not, as that is exactly what we're covering here today, as we explain every legendary Pokemon. We'll be going in Pokédex order, with a few exceptions for legendaries that were introduced at different times than the rest of their groups, such as Enamorus. Let's get started with the legendary birds. These guys were the OG legendaries, and I think their designs have aged pretty well overall, even if their usefulness in battle kind of hasn't. The first of these three entities is Articuno. Being such an old legendary, the dex entries for this Pokemon have changed quite a bit over the years, but the common consensus seems to be that Articuno has the ability to cool the air around it, turning it into snow and summoning blizzards. It is said that Articuno's wings are made of ice themselves, which might explain how it cools the air. Articuno also apparently appears to doomed hikers on mountains, which is pretty bleak. But I mean, if I was stranded on a mountain about to die, seeing this magnificent beast would at least be a silver lining. Articuno also has a Galarian form, as do all the other legendary birds, but because it was introduced so recently, we don't have nearly as much information on it. It apparently still has the ability to freeze things via its freezing glare, and it supposedly keeps itself afloat with its psychic powers despite despite still being a flying type. The second member of the legendary birds is the likely fan favorite, Zapdos. Inspired primarily by the Thunderbird, Zapdos lives in thunder clouds and has the ability to control electricity. It is most commonly seen when thunderclouds split in half. Interestingly, its Pokemon Stadium Dex entry claims it can actually summon thunderstorms by flapping its wings, but most other Dex entries say it simply lives in them. Its Galarian form is flying fighting rather than flying electric, and in this form it mostly just wants to throw hands. It is far more muscular than Cantonian Zapdos despite being smaller, and its legs are also a lot stronger, as they're able to deliver kicks that can destroy dump trucks. This form, I believe, is inspired by the Roadrunner. And the final member of the trio is Moltres, which is a flying fire type. The most obvious inspiration for Moltres is, of course, the Phoenix, although it does get overshadowed by Ho-Oh in that department, and frankly, pretty much every other department. Sorry, Moltres. A lot of Moltres' early Dex entries mention that it has the ability to dip its body into lava if it needs to heal, which really emphasizes the molten part of its name, but this idea seems to have been replaced by the idea that it brings spring in later Dex entries. In fact, all three of the legendary birds are supposed to represent the coming of a new season, with Zapdos representing summer and the thunderstorms characteristic of summer, and Articuno obviously representing the winter. Autumn is not outright represented, which just makes it all the more interesting just how connected Autumn is to Ho-Oh. And before you leave that comment, no, there is no connection between the legendary birds and Lugia like there was in the Pokemon 2000 movie. That was purely a construct of the movie, but we'll be talking more about Lugia's weird history in its designated slot. Galarian Moltres seems to just be Moltres, but evil. Its flames are sinister, and its victims become burned out shadows of themselves. I wonder where that idea came from. The last thing I should mention about the legendary birds is that their names are all partially constructed of Spanish numbers. Arctic Uno, Zapdos, Moltres. I'm sure you already knew this, but in case you didn't, there you go. Now it's time to talk about Mewtwo. Mewtwo is a human-made Pokemon that was created to push the bounds of genetic engineering and create the strongest Pokemon humanly possible. In this, the scientists who created Mewtwo, likely Dr. Fuji and Blaine, were successful. They rearranged the DNA gathered from the Pokemon Mew, engineering it to try and increase the strength of their creations. As Mewtwo became stronger though, it lost empathy and started to focus solely on battle. Eventually, Mewtwo escaped the facility it was kept in on Cinnabar Island and fled to Cerulean Cave, where it now rests. While it is implied by the games that only one Mewtwo was created, both the anime and manga now imply that there are multiple. Regardless of how many there are, Mewtwo stands among the most popular Pokemon even to this day, in large part because it was just such a good character in the first Pokemon movie. And the final Kanto legendary is Mew. Mew technically isn't a legendary, but a mythical Pokemon. But guess what? We're talking about the mythicals in this video too. That's right, we're not leaving any legendaries behind. Well, maybe Phione. Anyway, when it was originally introduced, Mew was the first Pokemon. It is believed to be the common ancestor of all Pokemon, as the genetic code for all Pokemon exists within its DNA. This is what gives Mew the ability to learn so many moves, and is also the reason it is one of the few Pokemon that can learn Transform. It was originally discovered by Mr. Fuji in South America, who then took it back to the Kanto region to experiment on it, as we already stated. There's a popular fan theory that the Pokemon Ditto is actually a byproduct of failed experiments on Mew, as the two Pokemon have a high number of shared stats, like being the same weight, having identical spray and shiny colors, and being able to learn Transform, which is an extraordinarily rare move otherwise. Another interesting tidbit about Mew is that apparently not even Nintendo knew it was in the game when Red and Green originally came out, as Shigeki Morimoto added it after the debugging process was done just 2 weeks before the game's released. It is wild that a Pokemon as iconic and important as Mew almost didn't make it into the original games, but that does also explain why it was absent from a lot of promotional material like the Pokerap. Now though, it's time to move to Johto, which actually has some pretty cool legendary Pokemon. That's not to say say Kanto's legendaries aren't cool, but I feel like a lot of people sleep on Johto when it comes to legendaries for whatever reason. Let's start with the legendary beasts. These 3 beasts have some of the most memorable lore in Pokemon. One night, the Brass Tower was set ablaze by a thunderstorm and burned to the ground. Trapped inside were 3 Pokemon, all of whom ended up perishing in the fire. However, after the fire subsided, Ho-Oh appeared and not only resurrected them, but also turned them into the legendary Pokemon Suicune, Raikou, and Entei. It's a simple but very mythological story, and it's some of my favorite lore in Pokemon. But there's more to say about these beasts than just what made them legendary. At least that's the case for Entei and Suicune. Raikou kind of got the short end of the stick, and you'll soon understand why I say that. Raikou is the electric type member of the legendary beasts, and it is supposed to represent the lightning that set the tower on fire. The rain cloud it carries on its back can release thunderbolts at will, and its roar sends shockwaves through the air and sounds of thunder. It seems to be inspired by a Raijin, a Japanese god of lightning, but could also be inspired by the Nue. Apparently, Raikou went through a lot of different tiger-based design concepts over the course of its creation, which could be why it seems so much less prevalent outside of the games when compared to Entei and Suicune. Entei is said to represent the fire that burned the tower down, and while the one we know from Gold and Silver was created through resurrection, apparently they can also be born from volcanic eruptions too, according to their dex entries. The Pokedex also says Entei embodies the passion of magma and that volcanoes erupt when it barks, which is a very interesting reproductive cycle. Like, if an Entei gets pissed at another Pokemon and barks up a storm, will that just birth a bunch of Entei via volcanic eruptions? If that were the case, I feel like there'd be way more of them, you know? Anyway, much like Raikou, Entei seems to be inspired by a big cat as well. This time, a lion. From a mythological perspective, it was likely also inspired by the lion dogs of China. Entei was also featured as the main antagonist of the 3rd Pokemon movie, Spell of the Unknown. Although technically this wasn't a real Entei, just an illusion created by the Unknown. And finally, we have the fan favorite, or at least the Pokemon Company's favorite, Suicune. Suicune represents the rain that put out the fire that burnt down the Brass Tower, and it is said to be the reincarnation of the northern winds. It runs gracefully across the lands and has the ability to purify water instantly, and was apparently popular enough to become the mascot of Pokemon Crystal, which is pretty cool since it's the only time a member of a lesser legendary trio has appeared as a mascot. In Crystal, Suicune makes periodic appearances throughout your journey across Johto and almost seems to be watching or following you to some extent before you catch it in the Tin Tower. Interestingly, the routes and locations it appears are different in the remakes, as it travels around Kanto quite a bit as well in those games. Suicune also played a large role in the 4th Pokemon movie along with Celebi, who we'll talk about in a little bit. So with Entei getting its own movie and Suicune getting its own game and having a major role in a movie, hopefully you understand why I say Raikou got the short end of the stick. Maybe that's why they decided to make Raging Bolt such a monster of a Pokemon. All 3 of the legendary beasts actually got past Paradox forms in Scarlet and Violet, with Entei's being Gouging Fire and Suicune's being Walking Wake. But we don't have much information on these 3 on account of them being so brand new. All 3 of their Pokedex entries have emphases on just how strong and ruthless they are, which makes sense as they are all based on different kinds of dinosaurs. But enough of that legendary trio, let's move on to Lugia. Lugia is one of the most fascinating Pokemon to me, because it was never supposed to exist. Okay, let me explain. Lugia was originally designed for the 2nd Pokemon movie rather than Gold and Silver. Originally, Ho-Oh was supposed to be the sole legendary of the Johto region, but Lugia was added at a later date, as we can see in the 1999 demo. The original designer of Lugia, Takeshi Shudo, saw the Pokemon as a maternal figure and wrote them to be the creator of all life on Earth. But this was later changed by another party, and the Pokemon was made the guardian of the sea instead and given a more male representation with a male voice in the movie, which the original creator disagreed with and regretted. While we're talking about Pokemon the movie 2000, I want to reiterate that Lugia has no actual connection to the legendary birds in lore, despite it being portrayed that way in the film. So if you didn't know that, sorry to burst your bubble. Lugia's dex entries corroborate it being the guardian of the sea, but also put a huge emphasis on just how strong its wings are, stating that just one flap can cause a storm that lasts 40 days, and even a light flutter of its wings can destroy houses. However, unlike a different sea-based deity, Lugia does not want to be destructive, so instead it sleeps deep underwater. Lugia also got a fairly cool redesign in Pokemon XD Gales of Darkness, where it became Shadow Lugia, the ultimate shadow Pokemon. This form is exclusive to this game though, and it is impossible to transfer it out without first purifying it. Next is Ho-Oh. Ho-Oh is undoubtedly one of the most important Pokemon to the early days of the franchise. Not only did it appear in the very first episode of the Pokemon anime, but as we established earlier, it is also central to the creation of the legendary beasts, and at one point in development might have even held a connection to the legendary birds, as it seems to be closely related to autumn, which is the one season that is missing from their pattern. Ho-Oh is said to constantly fly around the world on its magnificent wings, granting any who see it eternal happiness and good fortune. It also, obviously, has the ability to bring beings back from the dead, although we don't know exactly how this works. It's likely that the item Sacred Ash is involved, as Sacred Ash is an item that is held by Ho-Oh that can revive up to 5 Pokemon at a time in-game, but this item does not make new legendary Pokemon like Ho-Oh did in that moment. Regardless, the inspiration for Ho-Oh could not be more obvious. It's the Phoenix, more specifically Feng Wang in the Huma. The Huma specifically is seen as a symbol of good fortune, which matches up pretty well with Ho-Oh's dex entry. And the final legendary Pokemon of the Johto region is everybody's favorite time-traveling onion fairy, Celebi. Celebi was the first Pokemon able to time travel, excluding fossils if you want to count that as time travel, which I guess it kind of is, but I digress. It is said that Celebi wanders across time, causing grass and flowers to flourish when it appears. However, it only appears in times of peace. Its Pokédex entry says that it protects the forest, which I think is implied to mean Ilex, but since the Gen 2 games, we have seen it appear periodically in other forests as well. So there's a good chance that the forest it refers to is dependent on the region that it is in. Celebi also plays a huge role in the 4th Pokemon movie, Celebi, the Voice of the Forest. And it is also tied to the infamous GS Ball plotline of the anime, as it was originally supposed to be contained within the GS Ball before the whole arc was thrown out and the GS Ball with it. And now we move to one of my personal favorite regions, the Hoenn region. Hoenn was the first region I ever played, and as such it holds a special place in my heart. In my opinion, it has some of the coolest legendary designs, with many of them inspiring a feeling of awe or wonder in a way that not a ton of legendaries do. We'll be starting with the legendary golems, or giants, or Regis. The golems are interesting because they're one of the few groups of legendaries that has expanded over time, with new members being added on 2 separate occasions. For now though, we're just gonna stay focused on the OG3, Regirock, Regice, and Registeel. Aside from the funny noises these guys make in the movies, this trio is known primarily for their insanely cryptic and overly complicated methods of obtaining, as you have to decode like 4 different braille messages to get each one. It's the type of stuff your friend would tell you on a playground in order to obtain Mew 3, except it's actually in the games. It's wild. In order to unlock Regirock, the player must move either to the right or left 2 tiles, depending on the game, then move down 2 tiles, and then use Strength. Regirock is, in my opinion, the most recognizable of the original trio. According to its dex entries, it was sealed away by people long ago, and it has the ability to repair itself in battle just by picking up rocks that are around it. This kind of makes me wish it had an ability like Ice Body or Rain Dish, but for sand, as that would fit its lore very well. But instead, it just gets pressure or sturdy. Another one of its dex entries says that the rocks that make up its body come from all across the world, which is kind of interesting when we add the context of its previous dex entry, because together they kind of imply that prior to its imprisonment, the golem kind of just wandered the earth. Next in the trio is Regice. Regice's defining feature is that it is really, really cold, like negative 328 degrees Fahrenheit, or negative 200 degrees Celsius for all you metric people out there. Its body originally formed way back during the Ice Age, meaning it is at least 11,000 years old, and it is apparently formed out of Antarctic ice. It also cannot be melted by pretty much anything, even magma, so there's definitely some supernatural properties in this golem as well, which I guess makes sense. chance. The puzzle to unlock Regice's chamber differs quite a bit depending on the game. In the original Ruby and Sapphire, as well as the remakes, you have to stand outside the door and wait for 2 minutes for it to open. This does still work if the game's internal battery has dried up, in case you're wondering, as it's based on a recorded in-game time and not the battery timer. In Emerald, you just have to run 1 lap around the room while sticking right next to the wall. I'm not entirely sure why they decided to change this for Emerald, but I kind of like the new updated version more. Waiting 2 minutes is just kind of anxiety-inducing. How do I know if I've waited long enough? Will the door automatically open, or do I have to go press on? Oh, there it goes. And finally, we have Registeel. Registeel seems to be the most mysterious of the 3 golems. Its body is composed of a metal that is harder than any known metal, yet somehow it shrinks and stretches with flexibility. Apparently, it was hardened underground by extremely high pressures for tens of thousands of years, meaning it is likely the oldest of the Regis aside from Regigigas. There's a strong possibility the metal actually came to Earth via a meteorite, as its dex entry for Sapphire says the metal is not of this world. While it might sound like a contradiction to say the metal spent tens of thousands of years being tempered underground but also came from space, it is technically possible, just super unlikely. All 3 of the golems were imprisoned by people long ago, but the exact methods are not known to us. Personally, I'd love to see a Legends Hoenn game centered around these sealing events, but I know that's not exactly likely considering this trio is not really the most popular and we already got Hoenn remakes. But we have to move on from the Regis for now, as we have to cover the Lati duo. Latios and Latios are 2 of the most deeply connected legendary Pokemon ever made, to the point that even their Mega Evolutions are similar color-wise. They also share a typing of Dragon and Psychic, and have identical stat spreads with their attacking and defensive stats swapped. They even share an exclusive item in the Soul Dew, which I think is the only time an item like this has 2 exclusive users. Latios is the first of these 2 in the Pokedex and was originally introduced in Sapphire. According to its dex entries, it is extremely intelligent and sensitive to people's emotions. When hostile people or Pokemon come near it, Latios can use the down on its body to become invisible by controlling how it refracts light. Latios, on the other hand, can transmit images into the heads of foes telepathically and is also intelligent enough to understand human speech. The most memorable aspect of Latios, though, is probably the fact that it can apparently outspeed jet planes when it folds its wings. As for inspiration, it's pretty opaque for these 2. One of the more clear inspirations is Eos, the Greek goddess of dawn, as Latios has a similar name, and there's also a blue parrot genus known as the Eos genus, which would match Latios's blue coloring. The duo is also known as the Aeon duo, which could be a reference to the Aeons of Gnostic religions, but I do not know nearly enough about religion to talk about that, so let's just move on to the Weather trio. But first, please consider subscribing. If you want more Pokemon content, this is the channel to subscribe to. I have so many cool and unique videos coming in the next few months, and I promise you're not going to want to miss them. Plus, subscribing is just one of the best ways that you can help the channel aside from watching videos, so I would really appreciate if you would subscribe. Anyway, the Weather trio are arguably some of the most recognizable and beloved legendary Pokemon. All the members of this trio are so well designed and have kept their relevance in both competitive and casual spheres of Pokemon since their inception. As the name implies, the Weather trio focuses on weather conditions that can occur in Pokemon battles, specifically rain and sun for Kyogre and Groudon respectively, and the neutralization of weather for Rayquaza. These 3 are also known as the Super Ancient Trio, thanks to them being super powerful and super old. Kyogre is the first of these 3, and it is a water type. According to its dex entries, Kyogre expands the sea when it appears via torrential rainfall, and when it's not beefing with Groudon or destroying the world, it sleeps deep in undersea trenches. Kyogre seems to be vaguely inspired by the Leviathan of Hebrew mythology, as the sea-based monster would battle Behemoth, a land-based monster, and they would fight until the end of time, which is pretty much exactly what Kyogre and Groudon do. Kyogre also draws some inspiration from the Greek symbol for alpha and its markings, which are even more greatly emphasized in its primal reversion. Both Kyogre and Groudon were given primal reversions in the Hoenn remakes, which which returns them to their original, stronger states. These states cannot be manifested in the modern era due to the lack of primal energy available for transformation, so these two need to hold either the red or blue orb respectively in order to reach their full power. Primal Kyogre does not have too many differences from base Kyogre aside from being bigger and having an upgraded ability in Primordial Sea. This ability is almost identical to regular Rain, except it causes all damaging fire-type moves to fail, cannot be replaced by normal weather conditions, and will remain in effect as long as Kyogre is on the field. Groudon, even in its base form, is pretty much the exact opposite of Kyogre. It expands land masses when it appears due to the intense heat and droughts it creates, and sleeps within pools of magma when it rests. As we already stated with Kyogre, Groudon seems to be loosely based on Behemoth, or at least the myth containing its conflict with Leviathan. It also has markings on its body resembling a Greek letter, this one being Omega, which is once again more pronounced in its primal form. Primal Groudon comes with the unique ability Desolate Land, which is pretty much the same as Primordial Sea, but for the sun, meaning that damaging water-type moves do not function while this weather condition is up, which is pretty good considering Primal Groudon gets a secondary typing of fire, giving it a 4 times weakness to its biggest op. One interesting tidbit about Groudon and Kyogre is that in the original Ruby and Sapphire, the dex entries of the games the legendaries weren't in spoke of them positively. Groudon's entry for Sapphire states that it was a savior to people who were suffering from terrible floods, and Kyogre's dex entry in Ruby says that it saved people who were suffering from droughts. Of course, their Emerald and Oras dex entries were not nearly as complimentary. Maybe Rayquaza slapped some sense into the writers of the Pokédex, because I get the feeling that no one knows these two better than the Green Noodle. Rayquaza has long been a super fan favorite thanks to its all-around cool design and undeniably sick shiny. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of legendaries with cool shinies, but not many work as well as this black and red color scheme. Rayquaza is basically that friend that breaks up the fight when it comes to Groudon and Kyogre. It is said to live primarily in the ozone layer and has lived up there for hundreds of millions of years. This thing has been vibing in the outer atmosphere since there was an outer atmosphere. It seems the only reason it ever really comes down from the sky is to calm Groudon and Kyogre, and it does a very good job of that, as it is able to quell their rage with literally one cry. Like, it doesn't even have to throw hands or anything, it just has to be there. Rayquaza seems to be inspired by a mix of different dragons and birds from mythologies around the world. Its most direct inspiration is Quetzalcoatl, but it could also be inspired by the Ziz or the Lindworm. There's likely also a bit of inspiration from Japanese dragons as well, since it has 3 claws per hand, which is common among Japanese dragons. Then there's Mega Rayquaza. Mega Rayquaza is, as far as we know, the first Pokemon to ever Mega Evolve, doing so by channeling humanity's wish for salvation through the keystone of the leader of the Draconid people. The reason I say as far as we know is because the origins of Mega Evolution seem to shift with every game that involves Mega Evolution. First it was the ultimate weapon, then it was Mega Rayquaza, and now it might be related to Zygarde 2 in some way, so it's a bit hard to say what the truth actually is in this case. Regardless, it is still an incredibly strong Pokemon, and because of its method of Mega Evolution, it is the only Mega at this time that does not need to hold a Mega Stone to Mega Evolve, which is just broken on so many levels. It also gains a new ability as well, known as Delta Stream, which essentially removes the weaknesses of flying-type Pokemon and overwrites any normal weather effects that appear on the field. Lastly, for Hoenn, we have 2 mythical Pokemon to talk about. First up is the Wishmaker Jirachi. Jirachi is very simple compared to the Weather Trio and the Pokemon that follow it. It basically wakes up once every 1,000 years to grant a wish, and then goes back to sleep. Its main inspiration seems to be the concept of wishing upon a star, as well as the star festival Tanabata. Interestingly, Jirachi does have a signature move in Doom Desire, which is a really dark move name for an otherwise cute Pokemon. And finally, the last legendary of Hoenn, Deoxys. Deoxys is an extraterrestrial Pokemon that formed after an alien virus mutated into a Pokemon. Depending on the Dex entry, the cause of this mutation is different. Diamond and Pearl say the mutation happened after it fell to Earth, while others say it happened after exposure to a laser beam. Regardless of its origin, this Pokemon is really known for one thing: its forms, as Deoxys was one of the first Pokemon to ever sport more than 2 highly different forms. Deoxys has 4: Normal, Attack, defense, and speed. Each one, aside from normal, provides a huge boost to each of its respective stats. Although at this point, these forms seem to be getting power crept, which is kind of insane. Interestingly, in Gen 3, each form has a different Pokédex entry due to the different forms only appearing in their designated games. Starting in Sinnoh though, the forms were changed by clicking on a meteorite, which greatly improved the Pokemon's flexibility. For whatever reason, Deoxys and Rayquaza seem to have another unending beef. While this is likely because Rayquaza sees Deoxys as a threat to its home of the ozone layer, it is kind of funny just how many Pokemon Rayquaza seems to have an issue with. It's like the strict babysitter left to look after Earth while Arceus is out for a pack of cigs. Deoxys is obviously based on DNA and the double helix, but it is also likely based on viruses as well due to their propensity to mutate and change rapidly, much like Deoxys's forms. Overall, it is a very cool Pokemon and is among my favorite mythicals. Now though, we're moving into the Sinnoh region, which has a lot of legendaries, and I really like a lot of them. Unfortunately, our first Sinnoh legendary is not one of them. It's Yuxi. Look, I don't hate Yuxi, I just don't like it either. It's just kinda meh to me. Yuxi is known as the being of knowledge, and when it first flew, it gave people the ability to solve problems. It also has the ability to steal memories from those who see it or those who do evil. The inspiration for Yuxi are a bit harder to nail down though, as are the Lake Trios in general. They seem to be a mishmash of inspiration that is hard to decipher. Bulbapedia says the trio could be related to the high orders of angels, with Yuxi representing cherubim, the three sacred treasures of Japan with Yuxi representing Yada no Kagami, or a trio of Greek gods with Yuxi representing Hestia. All three of these have some connection to knowledge, which is why it's suggested that they are connected to Yuxi. Regardless, there is one very clear inspiration for Yuxi, and that is pixies. Yuxi, Pixie, I'm sure you see the connection. Next is Mesprit. Mesprit is the being of emotion, and when it flew for the first time, people learned the joy and sadness of living, and it has the ability to disrupt the emotions of opponents as well. But what Mesprit is probably best remembered for is being a roaming legendary for some reason, as if Sinnoh didn't already have enough of those. Mesprit is of course inspired by spirits and sprites, but it could also be inspired by Seraphim, Demeter, and Yasakami no Magatama, as these three all have a strong connection with emotion. And finally is Azelf. Azelf is the being of willpower. When it first flew, people gained determination, and according to Legends Arceus, it even has the ability to control the willpower of its adversaries. As for its inspirations, they're likely Hera from Greek mythology, thrones from Christianity, and the sacred treasure Kusanagi, as all three of these have a somewhat notable connection to willpower. But its most direct inspiration, much like the other two, comes from its name, gnomes. You thought I was gonna say elves, didn't ya? But its Japanese name is a gnome, literally a gnome. I can't believe my guy is the Smurf of legendaries. Anyway, let's move on from the Lake Trio and talk about the main trio of the Sinnoh region, the Creation Trio. The three Pokemon Arceus created first, each born to govern a different aspect of the universe. Dialga was created to govern time. As long as its heart beats, time flows, and it has the ability to traverse time with no issue. Dialga also possesses an origin form, which is different from the primal reversions of the previous generations. The origin form returns Dialga to a form closer to Arceus that admittedly looks a bit dumb. Unlike primal reversion, there is no change to ability or strength for the origin form, despite the fact that the Pokédex entries implies that it is stronger. Low-key, I kinda hope that these forms get changed to primal reversions now that Megas are back, but I don't know that something like that is likely. Dialga also likely represents the solid state of matter, as it is part steel type, and its unique item is the Adamant Orb, a word that used to be closely related to the hardness of diamond. Palkia, on the other hand, represents the expanse of space. As it breathes, space becomes more stable, and its control over not just space but also dimensions allows it to travel to wherever it wants, whenever it wants. Once again, its origin form is supposedly a form closer to Arceus, even if it is a choice. It also likely represents the liquid state of matter thanks to its water typing. Both Dialga and Palkia seem to be inspired by the legend of Izanami and Izagami, who created the islands of Japan by building a spear on a pillar, which is why the origin of the Sinnoh region is called Spear Pillar. And finally is Giratina. I know up to this point we've covered Pokemon in Pokédex order, but for Giratina it just makes more sense to keep it with its trio than it does to put it in its correct spot. Giratina has a fairly fairly similar origin to Dialga and Palkia. Originally, it was created to govern an aspect of the universe, antimatter. However, for some reason, Giratina was a lot more violent than the others, so Arceus banished it to the Distortion World for its violence. Despite this, when the world and the universe itself were in danger of being destroyed by Cyrus, Giratina came to the aid of Dialga and Palkia, releasing them before taking Cyrus to the Distortion World with it. I think this kind of recontextualizes the violence Giratina might have participated in. It clearly cares about Arceus' universe to some extent, or it wouldn't have stopped Cyrus. So perhaps its violence was aimed at those who disrespected the universe, but it went too far. Or perhaps its intervention was a mercy for Cyrus, as the intervention of Arceus probably would not have had such an amicable end for the man. As for inspiration, Giratina seems to be inspired by fallen angels, as the stories of God banishing angels to hell are not all that different from the stories of Arceus banishing Giratina to the Distortion World. Additionally, the body parts of Giratina seem to be arranged into the Devil's Number, as its altered form has 6 legs, 6 spikes on its wings, and 6 little neck things, and its origin form has 6 wings, 6 spikes on its body, and 6 little neck things as well. And yes, we can just say it, Giratina's origin form does look way better than Dialga or Palkia's. This trio is undoubtedly one of my favorites, not just for their lore, but also for their designs. But I'm also just a bit of a Sinnoh fan in general, so I might be biased. Anyway, Sinnoh still has more legendaries, including possibly one of the most random legendaries of all time, Heatran. Like, why does this guy exist? Don't get me wrong, I don't mind Heatran, but he's not part of any other legendary group or duo or anything. Bro just kind of exists and is a very bizarre standalone legendary. Even its dex entry just makes it sound like a normal Pokemon. It dwells in volcanic caves, digging with its cross-like claws. Like, if you told me that was the dex entry for Excadrill or something, I would probably believe you. It is mentioned in Legends Arceus that it is formed from the magma within Mount Coronet, so maybe that's why it's legendary, but who knows. One legendary whose existence does make sense though is Regigigas, as he's basically introduced as the leader of the Regis. It was originally created to tow the continents themselves across the earth, but it was later imprisoned by people who feared its power, which is pretty valid if we're being honest. A Pokemon that can move an entire continent is incredibly powerful. I'd be afraid of that too. Much like the original 3 golems, Regigigas was likely inspired by the golems of Hebrew mythology, but the fact it got sealed away means it could also be inspired by the Titans of Greek mythology and their sealing of the Titans. The final potential inspiration I could find is Aomisunu, a demigod from Kunubiki mythology that had the strength to move large chunks of land on a rope. And the final Pokemon before we get into the mythicals is Cresselia. Cresselia is the lunar Pokemon, and as such has a close association to the moon. It's even found on Full Moon Island, as if that wasn't a clear enough connection. Interestingly though, it doesn't represent the full moon, but the quarter or crescent moon, which also makes sense, but still. It's said that people who hold Cresselia's feathers are guaranteed to have joyful dreams, and according to Legends Arceus, it resembles the heavenly maiden that created the Milky Way, which is a very interesting statement, but it's not mentioned anywhere else, so it's probably not actually that important in lore. But that description is very similar to Jainu, the Chinese goddess of the moon, which could be a strong inspiration for Cresselia. Cresselia also has a connection to Darkrai, who we'll talk about in a little bit. First though, we have to talk about Manaphy. Am I forgetting someone? Nah. Manaphy is an interesting mythical. According to its dex entry, Manaphy is highly affected by the environments it lives in, and it has a unique knack of bonding with any Pokemon. Its body is 80% water, which makes sense as it is based on sea angels. Although, considering humans are 70% water, being 80% water as a water type doesn't actually sound all that impressive. Its most defining trait though is being the only mythical Pokemon that can breed, as when it breeds with a Ditto, it produces a Phione. You didn't think I'd actually leave Phione out, did ya? The reason I've been teasing about forgetting Phione is because there's just not much to say about it. The Pokemon likes warm water and can float around with the sack on its head. That's pretty much all the information we have on it. Even by the standards of mythical Pokemon, it does feel pretty neglected. Next is another Pokemon that has been pretty heavily neglected, especially in recent years, Darkrai. It just hasn't been the same since the Dark Void nerf, man. Darkrai is the opposite of Cresselia, and as such centers on on nightmares. In fact, it even has a unique ability that does passive damage to sleeping Pokemon just to drive home the point. Interestingly though, Darkrai is not an evil Pokemon despite its highly edgy design and dark typing. Really, it only afflicts those near it with nightmares as a method of self-defense. Although this dex entry does make its actions in Black and White 2 a bit more confusing. As for inspiration, Darkrai seems to be most directly connected to Naknitsa, an evil spirit in Slavic folklore that torments children in their sleep and slowly drains their life energy, which, again, kind of betrays the idea that it's not evil. Our penultimate mythical from Sinnoh is one of my personal favorites of the group. It's Shaman. Shaman is known to purify any areas of nature it resides in. It can always expel the toxins within its immediate radius. It also appears to act as a symbol of the changing seasons, not unlike Enamorus or the legendary birds. Shaman has a secondary form known as Shaman Sky. It is a form that is obtained by coming in close contact with the Gracidea flower. While in this form, Shaman is much more playful and courageous, but it will revert back to its normal form if night falls or if it gets frozen. Although as a grass flying type, this thing is not getting frozen very often. It just gets KO'd. As for inspiration, there doesn't seem to be a very clear mythological one. It's just a grassy hedgehog or a grassy reindeer. And now we have the final and first legendary of Sinnoh, Arceus, the god of Pokemon, responsible for the creation of the universe and many of the Pokemon within it. We all know the myth at this point. First, there was nothing. Then there was an egg that hatched into Arceus. Arceus would then form the creation trio as it shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms, which might be the unknown. After it was finished, it entered a deep slumber to rest and let the universe flourish and develop organically. Now, it can be found in the Halls of Origin, which reside above Spear Pillar. Its inspiration is very clearly gods in general, as well as the World Egg and perhaps Orpha's egg as well. Now let's move into Unova, which means we actually start with a mythical Pokemon for once, Victini. Victini is the victory Pokemon. Apparently, trainers with Victini will always win their matches, which is kind of crazy because that's not how it goes for me. It also has the ability to create infinite energy within its body, which it can then share with whoever it touches, which is kind of crazy as well. Like this one dude can fix our entire issue of carbon emissions. Moving on though, we have another legendary trio, kind of, the Swords of Justice. These three are said to protect Pokemon from both natural and human-made disasters. Their leader is Cobalion, who has been known to fight against human disasters specifically. It has a heart of steel, and while it is calm and composed, its iron glare can make almost any other Pokemon or person obey it. It is a natural-born leader and appears to be based on Athos from the Three Musketeers. Next is Terrakion, who protects Pokemon whose homes have been lost in wars. It is strong enough to break through walls with little issue and is based on Porthos from, again, the Three Musketeers. And finally is Verizon, who fights against humans to protect its friends. It is extremely fast and can confuse opponents with its movements. Virizion is based on Amaris from the Three Musketeers. All three of these guys work in tandem to protect Pokemon in different ways, but unfortunately that's kind of all we know about them. They're very neglected as far as legendary trios go, but they do get future Paradox forms in Scarlet and Violet. All of these forms are basically robotic versions of the modern variants, but their dex entries don't exactly reveal a ton of new information about them. It is also kind of sadly ironic that a trio focused on protecting nature ended up getting remade as robots. The Swords of Justice do actually have a fourth member though, in the mythical Pokemon Keldeo. Keldeo was not originally a member of the Swords of Justice, but after being taken in by the trio and being taught how to fight, it quickly became their strongest member. It also has the Resolute form, which is supposed to be stronger, but nothing really changes about it aside from it learning Secret Sword, which is different from Sacred Sword as I am learning as I write this video. While in Resolute form, it becomes far faster and far stronger, gaining the ability to cut through anything with its new horn. It seems to be inspired by the kelp of Scottish cryptozoology, as well as Detardigan from the Three Musketeers. But as cool and unfortunately neglected as the Swords of Justice are, we have to move on, because it's time to talk about the genies. Who doesn't love these guys? Tornadus is the first one we have to talk about. Tornadus zooms around on a cloud at up to 200 miles per hour. It can create strong gusts of wind due to its speed and can expel huge huge gusts of wind from its tail as well. Individually, it is likely based on Fujin from Japanese mythology. Next is Thunderous, who is said to fly around firing off lightning bolts from its tail. These lightning bolts apparently have the ability to enrich the soil they strike. More notable about Thunderous, though, is that the legendary is in an unending beef with Thunderous, with the duo constantly fighting whenever they come in contact. Thunderous is the second Pokemon we've seen based on Raijin, the kami of lightning. And finally, we have Landorus. While this Pokemon might be seen as evil by competitive players, it's actually surprisingly helpful according to its dex entries, as lands that are visited by Landorus are granted hugely bountiful crops. Its dex entry says that this is done using the forces of wind and thunder, which seems to insinuate it can harness the energy created by Thunderous and Tornadus. In fact, Legends Arceus says that Landorus is the one who stops the other two from beefing. This genie seems to be based on Ikari Okami, a land deity of Japanese myth, but it could also be inspired by the Jin of the East Wind, Urus, as it is often seen with crops and dry wind. All three of the genies also have a secondary form known as Therian forms, which are based on the Chinese four symbols or auspicious beasts. Thunderous is the azure dragon, Tornadus is the vermilion bird, and Landorus represents the white tiger. But wait, if there are 4 Chinese symbols, why are there only 3 genies? That is a great question, and the answer is because there is a 4th genie who was just introduced like a whole decade later in Legends Arceus. It's Enamorus. Enamorus is a lot more in line with Landorus, as its presence brings an end to winter, causing plant life to bud and grow across the region it lives in. It is likely based on Ugajin, a fertility goddess within Japanese mythology, and maybe more specifically Benzaiten. Its Therian form is, of course, based on the final Chinese auspicious beast, the Black Tortoise. We have just 3 legendaries left to cover in the Unova region before our next set of mythicals, and those are, of course, the box legendaries, Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem. These 3 are often called the Tau Trio by fans due to their symbolic connection to Taoist iconography, but this is not the title the Pokemon Company uses formally. These 3 Pokemon likely come from one Pokemon known as the Single Dragon. See, the Unova region was originally founded by 2 brothers, one who wanted to search for truth and one who wanted to chase ideals. Both brothers were guarded and guided by a single dragon, and as the 2 brothers fought, the single dragon split itself into 2, Reshiram, who sided with truth, and Zekrom, who sided with ideals. Reshiram is meant to represent Yang in the yin-yang circle in Taoism. Its fire is said to burn those who reject truth. Zekrom represents the yin side, and its electricity is said to destroy those who lose righteousness in their hearts. But there's a possibility this split of the dragon was not perfect. Depending on the sources you use, there could have been leftovers made in the process, which would take the form of Kyurem. The reason I say this might not be the case is due to an old legend in Lacusona Town, which states that Kyurem originates from a crashed meteor rather than being a part of the single dragon. Technically, both of these can be true simultaneously if we assume the entire single dragon is what crash landed in the meteor and not just Kyurem, but I feel like the pieces don't quite fit right for that to be true. Regardless of its origin, Kyurem has the ability to fuse with both Reshiram and Zekrom to become either white or black Kyurem respectively. This is done via the DNA splicers, and in both forms it essentially gains a bunch of signature moves and not much else. Not even Kyurem's typing changes, even though I always thought it did for some reason. Rather than representing yin or yang like its counterpoints, Kyurem actually represents Wuji, or the absence of yin and yang, more specifically the state of ultimate nothingness. I've been thinking about making a video that really dives into Kyurem like I did for Necrozma, so if that is something you want to see, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. For now though, we have to move on to the last 2 mythicals of the Unova region, Meloetta and Genesect. Meloetta is of course a music-based Pokemon, and it has the ability to control the feelings of those who hear its music. It has 2 forms, Aria, which is normal and psychic, and Pirouette, which is normal and fighting. It switches between these 2 forms using Relic Song, which is a pretty cool way to change forms. The idea here is that the Aria form is supposed to represent more of a singer. Specifically, I believe in opera singer, as the aria is a type of song that is instrumental to opera. Get it? Instrumental. Pretty good. Pirouette, on the other hand, is a ballet dancer, which we can deduce from the significance of pirouettes in ballet. One cool detail is that her hair is actually a music staff like you would find on sheet music, as it has 5 lines and 4 spaces, which is customary in the Western styles of music her forms are based on. Genesect, on the other hand, has one of the coolest origins in my opinion. It is a reanimated fossil Pokemon that has been upgraded by putting a cannon on its back. Part of this upgrade is that it can change the type of its signature Extra Move, Techno Blast, depending on the different drive it holds. It can become electric, fire, ice, or water, but honestly, I think they should have just given it different forms like Rotom. Like, it's crazy that this little dude has more flexibility with its unique forms than a mythical. A lot of people suspect the ancient Pokemon that acted as the base for Genesect was Kabutops, due to their similarities in stature and posture, but we don't know exactly when Kabutops went extinct, so it's hard to say if this is true or not. Regardless, it's time to move on from the Unova region and talk about the Kalos legendaries, which are known as the Aura Trio. Yeah, these guys are actually the only legendaries in Gen 6 if you exclude the mythicals. Not sure exactly why these games were so low on legendaries, but Zygarde alone is like 4, so that kind of makes up for it. First though, we have to talk about Xerneas, and oh dear, does this one have a lot going on. Xerneas is a Pokemon that can share eternal life, which is done when the antlers on its head start to glow. In X, it is this power that allowed the ultimate weapon to fire and brought Floette back to life. Because Xerneas can command an unlimited amount of life energy, it could potentially create its own rogue mega evolution event similar to Anj. Obviously, Xerneas' most direct inspiration is Yggdrasil, the Tree of Life. I'm sure I don't need to tell you why. Yveltal, on the other hand, is a Pokemon that absorbs life energy and is generally connected to death and destruction. It needs to maintain a balance with Xerneas to keep the Kalos region stable, as too much life or too much death could lead to the deterioration of the ecosystem. When there's too much energy, Yveltal is generally the one to clean that up, but not much more is known about how it absorbs life energy. Unlike Xerneas, Yveltal doesn't seem to have a direct inspiration within mythology. It seems like the Morrigan is the closest, as it is an eagle that sits at the edge of the world. Also, in case it wasn't obvious, Yveltal is based on the letter Y and Xerneas is based on the letter X. So I'm sure you can guess what Zygarde is based on, right? Well, I can't, because this does not look like a Z to me. Where do we start with Zygarde? At its base, Zygarde is a collection of cells that are individually too weak to even be considered Pokemon. They rely on coalescing around a Zygarde core to combine their power, which grows after reaching certain thresholds. The first threshold is at 10%, which allows it to access the 10% form. 10% form is by far the weakest form, but it's still not that weak, as it can make super quick work out of opponents using its fangs. It's also pretty fast, as it can run at land speeds that exceed 60 miles per hour. Its real-life inspiration could be the wolf god Fenrir, who is one of Loki's children. The second threshold is at 50%, where Zygarde takes on a more serpentine form. It seems to be partially inspired by insects though, as its hexagonal eyes are reminiscent of compound eyes in the real world. 50% Zygarde is the form we originally see in X and Y, and it is at this point that Zygarde starts to monitor the ecosystem for those who might seek to destroy it. It's apparently hugely vicious and ruthless in this form, showing no mercy to those who threaten it. This form is likely based on another one of Loki's children, Jormungandr, which is a large serpent that encircles Earth, providing a connection to both its snake-like stature and its connection to Earth. 100% form is created when all of Zygarde is in one place, and it is even far stronger than the 50% form. It can overpower even Xerneas and Yveltal without too much issue, and the orifice on its chest can produce enough energy to eliminate almost anything. This form might be based on Hel, another child of Loki. However, I think it's far more likely that it is based on giant mechs, because, I mean, just look at it. It's also worth noting that in the video games, Zygarde Complete can only be accessed if 10% or 50% Zygarde fall below 50% HP, at which point it will automatically transform. This was likely done as a balancing mechanic, as having Complete Zygarde at 100% HP would have just been broken. I wish they'd thought a little bit more about said balancing mechanics when it comes to Mega Zygarde, because this thing is just so insane. Mega Zygarde is just Zygarde Complete, but with a laser cannon. It has the same amount of cells, but they have been reorganized to optimize its strength. We can see this pretty clearly, as the wings that were once iconic for Zygarde Complete are now completely gone. Instead, many of them have been reallocated to this cannon that it uses. Low-key, I kinda think this form of Zygarde looks naked, but that's not important. Zygarde seems to only Mega Evolve in response to people's emotions, and it uses its immense power to calm and protect them. Inspirations for Mega Zygarde are still being largely worked out due to its newness, but some people have pointed out how it kind of looks like a tree, or how its cannon is made out of wood, driving home its connection to the ecosystem. For a Pokemon that's gotten as much love as Zygarde, I feel like we still don't know that much about it. Like, we know what it does, but where did it come from? Why does it protect the ecosystem, and why is it so strong? This dude was zipping around Lumios for the entirety of Legends ZA, and I feel like we got so few answers as to what it actually is. But I digress, we have mythicals to talk about, starting with Diancie, aka knockoff Carbink. That's not even a joke, it's literally literally a mutated carbink, albeit a stronger mutation. Diancie has the ability to create diamonds by creating a high amount of pressure between its hands, but where it really shines is its Mega, as it's the only mythical Pokemon with a Mega evolution at the time of recording. Besides that though, our information on Diancie is pretty limited, so let's move on to the most relevant mythical of Kalos, Hoopa. Hoopa's main shtick is being able to make wormholes, more specifically hyperspace holes, which are created with its rings. These can transport people and Pokemon to different dimensions whenever Hoopa desires, and it even seems to have its own secret dimension that it puts things in to keep them safe. However, Hoopa is actually much more powerful than just this little guy. He also has his unbound form, which was originally sealed away in the prison bottle because it was just too destructive. In this form, its rings can stretch miles in length, and at one point it appeared to move an entire castle in the Kalos region. This means that all the hoops we see in the Hoenn region are the work of Hoopa, and considering Hoopa appears to be important to the New Legends ZA DLC, I'd say we're about to learn a whole bunch more about this little guy. And finally, we have Volcanion. I don't know why, but I always just kind of forget about Volcanion. Its design always reminded me of a knockoff Heatran a bit, and I never really paid attention to it, which is unfortunate because it does have the very cool typing of water-fire. Volcanion seems to center around steam, which isn't all that surprising, but what is the sheer power Volcanion holds, as it can apparently blow away mountains when it expels its internal steam. The exact inspiration for Volcanion is once again not all that clear. It's most likely geysers or volcanic activity, but besides that, it's kind of hard to point down a deity or something like that. And with that, we've covered all the legendaries in Kalos, which means it's time to move to the Alola region. But I do have to address something. We will not be covering the Ultra Beasts in this video, nor the Paradox Pokemon aside from the ones that are also legendary.